So we're looking at fertility and the limitation of fertility in colonial America and the Revolutionary Era period. So fertility was seen as part of a family's wealth, the abundance of life in colonial North America. And so we see here that being idealized in this picture of the family, all the children, fruit is on the table, and fruit's often seen as a symbol of fertility and abundance. Fertility was a woman's contribution to her family's wealth, and free women in the colonies had as many children as they possibly could. They typically married in their late teens or early 20s. They nursed each child for a year or two, and then they became pregnant again and had another child, roughly every 18 months or 2 years until menopause, which is a lot of kids. This was younger than women married in Europe, and almost all women married in the colonies, unlike in Europe. And so you have really rapid population growth. And this is seen as a good thing because children were seen as unpaid labor to contribute to the family farm, the family business. Of course, the real goal is to have sons. Sons are great because they continue the family name. They contribute to the work and the business. They bring money and status to the family if they marry well. And if you're a widowed mother, they actually help support you, hopefully. Daughters, on the other hand, daughters are going to join someone else's family. So you invest in them, but you don't really get much back comparatively. And so they're seen as more of a danger than anything else. They could be led astray by their weak natures, get into trouble, bring disorder to the family name. When we're looking at enslaved people, at first, there's very slow population growth. Initially, they're really focusing on trying to get men, trying to get people to work in the fields, not a lot of respect for pregnancy. But very quickly, as they realize that enslaved people are valuable, they do start encouraging pregnancy among enslaved women. And we do see an increase in population. Though it's always a problem because let's say you're in a northern colony. You might be the only person of African descent in the neighborhood, in the household. It's going to be really hard for you to find someone to have a family with. It's only once you start having more densely populated rural areas in the 18th century that it becomes much more possible for enslaved people to find partners and to have children and increase the population. The population of enslaved peoples does grow pretty rapidly. Part of that is because it's a very young population. And that's for the rather depressing reality, which is there are very few elderly enslaved people. They're just not surviving to that great age. Instead, the bulk of the population is young and therefore able to have children to increase that population. Interestingly enough, though, if you look at the population of the North once slavery has pretty much ended, you see that the free black population in the North pretty much has the same number of kids as the white population in the North, and that declines over time. There's a cost to this, having as many children as possible. Women had problems with vitamin deficiencies, calcium deficiencies, iron deficiencies after repeated pregnancies. They had problems with infections during childbirth, and of course, injuries. It's not uncommon for women to be injured during the process of giving birth. And women did die younger than men generally. The other damage was in babies because it wasn't uncommon for babies to be stillborn, to fail to thrive when their mothers were physically exhausted. And in fact, mothers who are trying to get ready to have the next child, who stops nursing their baby too soon, weans them too early, or passes them on to wet nurses, those children might not have as high a rate of survival as others. Women did have some options to try to care for themselves. And the thing is it's a different way of thinking about menstruation. Women in the colonial era, particularly the earlier colonial era, tended to think that your periods could stop for two reasons. They might stop because you were pregnant, but the other reason they might stop is because you were sick or worn out, suffering from mental despondency and hysteria, grief and distress, various kinds of ill health. And so they didn't necessarily think the fact that they had stopped having periods was a sign that they were pregnant. It could be, but it could not be. You really didn't know for sure you were pregnant until quickening, which is when you can tell that the baby's moving. You can feel the baby moving. And so a woman who felt that she was having a problem because her periods had stopped and they need to be restarted had things that she could do for that. They could do bleeding, which wasn't very effective. They could do vigorous exercises and baths to sort of try to re-stimulate it. And also they could take a number of herbal remedies that were sometimes plants that were imported from Europe and Africa. Sometimes they're adapting Native American plants. They some of them are more effective than others, depending on the quality of the plants and things like that. So it wouldn't be uncommon for women to mix the different plants, different herbal remedies. But the basic goal is to restart menstruation, and that's seen as bringing you back to health. It's not thought of as ending a pregnancy, even though that's what we think looking at this discussion. Things begin to change around the time of the revolution. And we look at it and we see that birth rates go down, particularly in northern urban areas, mostly among the comfortable people who are reasonably well off, what we might later call middle class. The urban poor still marry much earlier than people who are of higher status, and they have more children. And rural areas, rural northern areas see a decline in birth rates, but it's much slower than it is in cities. And in the South, birth rates don't decline at all. But still, there's this decline in the number of children that families are having in the urban North among the comfortable classes. So the question is, how is this happening? What is making this possible? Because frankly, there's some kind of great new birth control technology. They've got the same techniques they've always had for the most part. And yet, somehow something is changing to make it possible to have fewer children. Part of it is about changing ideas about women and about children. A greater focus on protecting mothers, companionate marriage, the idea of protecting mothers by not having as many children, spacing the birth further apart so a woman has longer to recover between births, and at least in the city, possibly trying to have a woman stop giving birth in her late 30s so she's not as worn out. She has a period in her life where she's giving birth a lot, but then she has a period where she's not, before menopause. So these changes are happening. The other thing is that there is an increasing idea of investing in children, whereas really the colonial idea was you had children because those children would contribute to the farm, would contribute to the business, would perform labor, help you maintain the family wealth or increase the family wealth. Increasingly, there's this idea that you actually have to invest in children. So you have to pay for them to go to school, to get special kinds of training. You may not put them to work as early as you would have otherwise. And so you sort of start looking at it as a child as something that you have to put money into rather than getting money back from. So how did they limit their fertility if they didn't have some new miraculous form of birth control? One of the things that they try is abstinence. And that required a lot of cooperation between the wife and husband. That could be really difficult to maintain, particularly because a husband would feel that he had a right to sex. That was something the wife had an obligation to supply to her husband. There were various attempts to only have sex during the time where a woman is not fertile, but they didn't understand women's reproductive cycles. So it's actually true that some of the advice that was given out in the 19th century on this issue, they actually gave them the incorrect advice. They were telling people to have sex at the most fertile time of the month rather than the least fertile time of the month. So abstinence might help, but it was difficult to maintain. Another thing is prolonged breastfeeding. And an artisan woman, a craftsman's wife, might actually take in a child to breastfeed after her own child was weaned. The idea is as long as you're breastfeeding, your body has fewer resources and it makes it harder for you to get pregnant. Now, this only applies in previous times when we had basically less nutrition and all the rest of that than we do today. It will not prevent you from getting pregnant. That's how I got my little sister. I always feel like I have to do a warning on this. Do not try breastfeeding as a method of birth control. It doesn't work today. But it made it less likely in the past. And that's something you have to keep in mind with a lot of this is their standards for contraception was more about reducing the number of children rather than eliminating them altogether. It's a different idea about what's possible. In some cases also, they will put off sex, abstain from sex while the woman is breastfeeding. That depended on the family, the couple. And that, of course, would, in addition, reduce fertility. They might attempt to use withdrawal, where the man withdraws before ejaculation. That depends on the husband, and it's not all that effective. They do have new devices that are available, but then for the most part, what people rely on are the older techniques we talked about before. Herbal remedies, physical exercise, vigorous physical exercise, hot baths, and things like that are ways to sort of interrupt the pregnancy, prevent it from being truly established. But the difference is, by this point in time, they're actually thinking of these things as contraception or abortificants. They're not thinking of them as just a matter of maintaining their health. They're actually thinking of them as having an effect on limiting fertility. Part of what's going on is a change in the way we think about children. And this is really a long-term change. This is the early stages of it. But it's this idea that children contribute to the income, increase the family's wealth, is that older way of looking at things. And eventually it's going to turn into children are something that you invest in, you put wealth into. And if you look at modern estimates of how much it costs to have a child, that's a very different way of thinking about having children from what we would have seen in the early colonial era. You have an increasing focus on protecting women's health through limiting fertility. And a lot of what we see here, this decline in having children, it's not because there's a great technological innovation. It's social changes that alter how women use the technology, the herbal remedies, the other kinds of things, abstinence, how they use those, and how they thought of them, rather than that there's some great new technology that solves the problem of contraception.